The sun had barely set over Romerville, Illinois, as Officer Taylor stepped onto the quiet street, the weight of his boots sinking into the soft ground. There was nothing particularly remarkable about this evening, just the usual end to a Sunday, the kind where neighbors tucked themselves into their homes, wrapping up their weekend. But for the Rowland family, it was the end of everything. When Zoraida's mother called in, her voice trembling with unease, the officers thought it was just another worried parent. No one had heard from their daughter, her husband, or the kids all day. People get busy, sometimes forget to check in. Yet as Officer Taylor surveyed the house from the curb, there was an odd stillness that tugged at him. The kind of stillness that makes your skin prickle, as though the world is holding its breath. The lights inside the house were off, save for a faint flicker from a room in the back, a flicker that looked more like a beacon in the gathering darkness. He pressed his hand to the doorbell. No answer. Not a single movement from inside. His partner, Officer Rhodes, knocked on the windows, peering inside, but it was like they were staring into a void. Stillness. "Check the backyard," Taylor said, a sense of urgency creeping into his voice. They stepped through the gate at the side of the house, the ground beneath their feet unnaturally quiet. As they reached the back door, Taylor saw it. Two lifeless dogs, lying on opposite sides of the kitchen floor. A lump rose in his throat. The sight of them stopped him cold. Who leaves their dogs to die like this? Why? A question that should have been answered with a simple, "They're just pets." But instead, it felt like a warning. He reached for the handle. The door was unlocked. "Get ready for entry," he radioed in, voice tight. Her internal buzzer. The scene beyond the door was not what he had expected. But then again, what is when something's been buried in a place you didn't think to look? What he didn't know was that behind that door lay an unfolding nightmare that no one was ready for. And welcome to True Crime Theater HQ. I thank you, my viewers, most especially my subscribers, for your support as we keep improving and bringing daily told and untold true crime stories. Update. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel. The officers entered cautiously, their boots muffled against the floor as they stepped deeper into the house. The air inside was thick with an unsettling silence, like it hadn't been disturbed in hours, maybe even longer. Every room felt cold, abandoned, except for the faint light at the far end, casting long shadows across the walls. Officer Taylor paused in the living room, scanning the space for anything out of place. A TV was knocked over, a coffee table turned on its side, as though a struggle had taken place. His eyes flicked to the floor, where the blood-stained paw prints of the two dogs trailed toward the kitchen. It was then that the unease became something heavier, like a warning he couldn't shake off. "Something's off," Rhodes murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Taylor nodded, his gut tightening. "I know. Keep your guard up." As they moved through the house, they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Even though no one was there, the place should have been alive with the sounds of a family, kids playing, the hum of a washing machine, something. But there was nothing. Only the echo of their footsteps and the shadows growing longer with each room they cleared. The hallway ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness, but the officers pressed on, the sense of dread building with each step. They reached the master bedroom, and the door creaked open slowly, revealing a scene so grotesque it took a moment to comprehend. There, in the middle of the room, lay the lifeless body of a man. His face was turned toward the ceiling, eyes open in a vacant stare, a pool of blood seeping out around him. The sight was jarring. A man who just hours ago had been someone's husband, a father to two young boys. Now, his life had been violently stripped away. Taylor's hand gripped his radio, his voice a strained whisper. "We've got a fatality, possible homicide. Officer down." But this wasn't just a simple murder. There were signs of violence, signs that this was deliberate, calculated. The bedroom door had been forced open, the lock shattered by what looked like a single powerful blow. The bed was overturned, sheets ripped in a way that suggested a struggle had taken place. The smell of blood mixed with something else, something metallic and cold. "Let's keep moving," Taylor ordered, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still ahead. As they moved toward the other bedrooms, the weight of the discovery settled over them like a lead blanket. Then, at the threshold of a bedroom at the far end of the hall, they found it. The bodies of 2 young children, no older than 7 and 5, lying on the floor. The same brutal violence had been visited upon them, their tiny bodies broken, their lives snuffed out in an instant. Taylor's breath hitched, and he swallowed hard. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was personal. Everything he had seen, every cold, lifeless thing, pointed to one simple, terrifying conclusion. Someone had methodically wiped out an entire family. And as the officers continued to clear the house, the question that lingered, no, threatened to consume him, was who, in their right mind, could do something like this? It was only when they stepped outside, their faces pale, that the enormity of it fully hit. The house, once a sanctuary, had become the backdrop to an unimaginable horror. And the killer was still out there. The moment the officers stepped back outside, the reality of the situation began to settle in. The once quiet neighborhood, with its neat lawns and suburban charm, felt more like a crime scene now. There were no simple answers, no easy explanations, just a series of questions, each one more urgent than the last. Handcuffed to the wooden table, Clarice Asher refused to move, and Detective Martinez arrived shortly after, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the house. He turned to Officer Taylor. "What do we know so far?" "2 dead dogs, a husband, a wife, and 2 children," Taylor replied, voice tight. "Looks like they were executed. No sign of forced entry, but the back door was unlocked. Whoever did this knew them." Martinez nodded, his expression grim. "We need to talk to family, friends, get a sense of who they were and who might have had access to the house." He looked toward the street, where neighbors were beginning to gather. "Start with the closest relatives. Maybe they've seen something strange or heard anything unusual." As the officers canvassed the neighborhood, they learned that Zoraida had been married to Alberto Roland for nearly a decade. They were well liked, their children often seen playing in the yard, a picture-perfect family. No one reported any issues, no history of domestic violence, no trouble with the law, nothing that could explain the brutal slayings. But then, as the detectives began to dig deeper into Zoraida's personal life, they uncovered something unexpected. Zoraida had been having an affair. Nathaniel, her boyfriend, had been in a relationship with her since 2015. This was a key lead, one that seemed to offer some kind of explanation, perhaps the motive for this horrifying crime. Martinez and his team moved quickly to speak with Nathaniel. They needed to hear his side of the story. He was working at a local auto shop, and when the detectives arrived, he seemed unaware of the magnitude of what had happened. "Can we talk to you for a minute?" Martinez asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Nathaniel looked up, his face a mask of confusion. "Is everything okay? What's going on?" "We're investigating a homicide," Detective Wagner added, cutting straight to the point. "Your girlfriend Zoraida Roland and her family have been killed. We have some questions for you." Nathaniel's eyes widened, but there was no immediate shock, no collapse of disbelief. Instead, he seemed hesitant, as though trying to process the information. I don't understand. I just talked to her last week." The detectives pressed further, asking about his relationship with Zoraida, her family, and any potential enemies she might have had. Nathaniel claimed he didn't know of anyone who would want to harm her, but when pressed about his ongoing affair with Zoraida, he grew defensive. The detectives took him further down the street until they came to the Ticcerie. He looked. "I didn't have anything to do with this," Nathaniel insisted, his voice shaking slightly. "I loved her. I don't know what happened," but as the officers spoke with him, they learned that Nathaniel's phone was a potential goldmine for answers. Messages between him and Zoraida, including some exchanged through encrypted apps, could hold vital clues. They needed access to his phone to cross-check his story, and he reluctantly agreed to hand it over. What they found next would send shockwaves through the investigation. The text messages didn't just suggest a typical affair, they suggested something darker. Hermelinda, Nathaniel's longtime partner, had been sending manipulative, angry messages, subtly implying that Zoraida's affair was a betrayal, something that would ruin everything. When they dug further into Nathaniel's phone, they found something more disturbing. A series of texts from Hermelinda urging him to confront Zoraida, planting doubts in his mind, feeding his jealousy, and accusing Zoraida of being involved in dangerous things. "Zoraida is a risk to us, Nathaniel," one message read. "She's talking to people she shouldn't be. You need to end this before it's too late." At first, Nathaniel had dismissed her warnings, but as the messages grew more intense, so did his paranoia. Hermelinda's manipulation was taking hold, pushing Nathaniel further into a corner. But what the detectives didn't know was that Hermelinda wasn't just a jealous girlfriend. She was the true mastermind of the entire plan. As they dug deeper, they learned that Hermelinda had been posing as a hacker, using fake identities to trick Nathaniel into believing that Zoraida was a threat. Using online tools, she made Nathaniel believe Zoraida was involved in something far more dangerous than an affair, something that could put their lives in jeopardy. Detective Martinez stood over the phone records, piecing together the truth. She set him up. She made him think Zoraida was the enemy. She manipulated him into killing her entire family, and it was working. Nathaniel, still unaware of how deep he had been pulled into Hermelinda's web, had already confessed that he and Hermelinda had discussed the idea of confronting Zoraida, even though he had no idea it would end in such brutality. But now, they had enough evidence to know that his involvement wasn't just a mistake. It was orchestrated. The detectives didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that Hermelinda was playing a far more dangerous game than anyone could have imagined. And soon, it would be too late to stop her. The deeper the detectives dug, the clearer it became. Hermelinda wasn't just a jealous girlfriend. She was a master manipulator. What had seemed like a simple affair gone wrong was, in reality, a well-orchestrated plan that had been in the works for months, perhaps even longer. Hermelinda had been feeding Nathaniel a series of lies, each one more dangerous than the last. Through phone dumps, the detectives uncovered a disturbing pattern of communication. Hermelinda had crafted elaborate stories, convincing Nathaniel that Zoraida was a danger to him, to them. She had posed as a hacker, using fake identities to manipulate Nathaniel's perception of Zoraida. She even went so far as to create fake evidence of Zoraida being involved with people connected to dangerous groups. Stories of a cartel, of secrets Zoraida was hiding, of things she could never come back from. Each message was more convincing than the last. Hermelinda had created an entire persona, one that was seemingly fluent in multiple languages, including Bulgarian, to make it seem like someone from Zoraida's dangerous world was reaching out. The texts came through apps like TextNow, encrypted and untraceable, so Nathaniel had no reason to question their legitimacy. Hermelinda made him believe that Zoraida was betraying him, manipulating him, and getting deeper into trouble with people who could ruin everything. But it didn't end there. As they dug further into the history of Nathaniel and Hermelinda's relationship, the detectives realized that Hermelinda wasn't just playing the role of the concerned girlfriend. She had planted seeds of doubt in Nathaniel's mind from the very start of their relationship. From the moment they had met, Hermelinda had subtly convinced Nathaniel that he was the victim, always the one being wronged, always the one who had to fight for what was his. The affair with Zoraida had only been the tipping point. It wasn't just about betrayal, it was about control. Hermelinda couldn't stand the thought of losing Nathaniel, and in her mind, the only way to keep him was to eliminate the person who stood between them. She had convinced him slowly but surely that Zoraida was a threat, and she had to be stopped. Through hours of interviews and a painstaking review of phone records, the detectives uncovered the heartbreaking truth. Nathaniel hadn't been the one to pull the strings. Hermelinda had been the puppeteer all along. She'd gone to great lengths to manipulate him, to make him feel justified in his anger and jealousy. She'd fed him the lie that Zoraida wasn't just another woman in his life. She was a threat, a danger to them both. Detective Martinez shook his head as the evidence unfolded before him. She didn't just manipulate him. She transformed him into someone capable of this. She made him think he was protecting himself, protecting them. The more the detectives learned, the more they began to understand the depth of Hermelinda's deception. She had even gone so far as to impersonate others online, using stolen images to create fake profiles, building a web of lies that Nathaniel couldn't see through. It was no longer just about the affair, it was about total control. Hermelinda had convinced Nathaniel that Zoraida wasn't just another lover, she was a threat to their very survival. At this point, the detectives realized they had to move fast. They knew that the evidence was pointing toward Hermelinda as the mastermind, but Nathaniel was still a crucial piece of the puzzle. They needed to get him to talk, to admit his role in the murders before it was too late. They decided to confront him once again, this time with a clearer picture of what had happened. But when they arrived at his place of work, Nathaniel was already on edge, visibly shaken. The tension between them was palpable as they walked toward him. "We need to talk, Nathaniel," Detective Wagner said, his tone direct. "About everything." Nathaniel seemed hesitant, his eyes darting back and forth, unsure of what to do. The pressure was mounting, but he still wasn't ready to admit his involvement. "I didn't know," Nathaniel muttered, his voice low. "I didn't know she was capable of—" But the detectives could see it in his eyes. He wasn't entirely innocent. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the full picture was still blurry. They pressed on, showing him the text messages, the lies, the manipulation. The guilt began to seep through as Nathaniel's resolve started to crack. "I didn't want it to happen," he whispered, his voice trembling. "But she told me I had to. She said it was the only way." The confession was coming, slow but sure. But as the truth began to unfold, the detectives knew they were only scratching the surface. Hermelinda wasn't done yet. There were still pieces of the plan they hadn't uncovered. Nathaniel's confession was just the beginning of a twisted game that had yet to reach its conclusion. The detectives were closing in, the walls tightening around Nathaniel. But he wasn't done yet. He wasn't ready to give them everything they needed. His confession, though crucial, left out too many details. The full scope of Hermelinda's manipulation was still out of reach, and they knew that if they didn't get him to fully break, the pieces of this twisted puzzle would remain incomplete. Detective Martinez stood over Nathaniel at his place of work, his eyes steely with determination. "We know you're involved. You can keep protecting Hermelinda, but you need to understand. This isn't going to end well for either of you. The truth is coming out, piece by piece. The sooner you admit it, the easier it will be on you." Nathaniel shifted uncomfortably, his hand gripping the edge of a nearby table. He was starting to unravel, but something still held him back. There was fear in his eyes, not of the detectives, but of Hermelinda. "She didn't want to hurt anyone," Nathaniel muttered, his voice shaking. She said it was the only way to protect us. She told me Zoraida had to be stopped. She wasn't just a woman. She was a threat." Martinez didn't flinch. He knew what they were dealing with now. Hermelinda had used Nathaniel's fear to control him, convincing him that Zoraida's affair wasn't just a betrayal, but a life-and-death situation. She had turned him into a pawn in her game. And it had worked. "We need to know everything, Nathaniel," Wagner pressed, his voice calm but forceful. "Did she threaten you? Did she say what would happen if you didn't go along with this?" Nathaniel hesitated, eyes darting to the side, as if the very thought of Hermelinda's wrath would send him spiraling. But the pressure was mounting. The reality of what he had done too much to bear. "She kept saying she couldn't lose me," Nathaniel whispered. "She said we would be together forever, but only if we did this. She made me believe it was the only way. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but she made me think it was necessary." Martinez exchanged a glance with Wagner. The confession was damning, but there was still something off about Nathaniel's tone. It wasn't just fear, it was guilt. Real, deep guilt. And the detectives knew that the true extent of the horror had yet to be fully revealed. Suddenly, the reality hit them. The investigation was about to take a darker turn. If they didn't act fast, they might lose Hermelinda completely. They needed to find her, and they needed to do it now. The next move was clear. They had to bring Hermelinda in. They had already tracked her movements, but as the hours passed, it became increasingly clear that she was trying to cover her tracks. She wasn't just hiding from the police. She was trying to disappear altogether. At the same time, Nathaniel began to crack under the pressure. His earlier defenses faltered as the detectives zeroed in on his relationship with Hermelinda. His gaze dropped to the floor, and it was then that he finally admitted what he had been avoiding. "I didn't want this," he said, his voice barely audible. "But she wouldn't let me go. She made me think we were meant to be together, no matter what." He paused, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to kill them." As Nathaniel spoke, Martinez could feel the final pieces slipping into place. The detective knew they were close to breaking Hermelinda's carefully crafted facade, but it wouldn't be easy. This was a woman who had expertly manipulated Nathaniel, made him her pawn in a game of control. But the game was nearly over. In the early hours of the next morning, police tracked Hermelinda to a rundown apartment on the outskirts of town. She was alone, desperate and cornered. Her plan had unraveled completely, and now there was no escaping the consequences. When the officers surrounded the building, Hermelinda wasn't going down without a fight. She tried to flee, running toward her car, but the officers were already there, blocking her path. It was clear from her frantic movements that she wasn't just trying to escape. She was desperate, willing to do anything to avoid facing the reality of what she had done. A standoff ensued, and Hermelinda refused to surrender. As the tension reached its peak, she made a break for it, rushing to the driver's side of her car, her fingers gripping the door handle. But before she could start the engine, the police had already surrounded her. Then the unthinkable happened. As the officers closed in, Hermelinda pulled out a gun, her hand trembling. The officers shouted for her to drop the weapon, but it was too late. She fired a shot, and then another. The sound of the gunshots rang through the air, echoing across the empty street. In the chaos, the police responded quickly, neutralizing the threat. But not before Hermelinda was struck. She collapsed to the ground, her breath shallow, the weight of her actions finally catching up to her. As paramedics arrived, it was clear that she wasn't going to survive. Her life, like Zoraida's, had ended in violence, and now she would pay the price. As Hermelinda's life slipped away, the detectives couldn't help but wonder how far her web of manipulation had spread. In the end, it wasn't just Nathaniel who had been trapped, it was everyone around her. And while the truth had finally come to light, the damage was irreversible. The case was closed, but the haunting questions remained. How could love turn into something so destructive? How could a woman's obsession with control lead to the deaths of an entire family? And, in the end, was anyone truly innocent? As the officers walked away from the scene, the heavy silence lingered. The horror was over, but its echoes would remain. The story of a family, torn apart by lies and manipulation, would never be forgotten. The investigation was over, but the scars left by the tragedy remained. Zoraida Rollin and her children were gone, their lives stolen in an instant by the twisted manipulation of someone they had trusted. Alberto Rollin's death, the brutal murder of two innocent children, the full weight of it hit the community hard. The police had done their job, but no amount of justice could bring back the family that had been so senselessly destroyed. Nathaniel, now facing charges for his role in the murders, sat in a holding cell, haunted by the consequences of his actions. His confession had come too late to save Zoraida or her children, but it was clear he had been a pawn, manipulated by Hedmelinda's lies. He had been driven by a toxic mix of love, fear, and jealousy, feelings that were twisted and warped by the woman he trusted most. As for Hedmelinda, her life ended in a violent confrontation with the police. The woman who had orchestrated it all, who had used Nathaniel as a tool in her game of control, was now a tragic figure. Her manipulation had not only destroyed the lives of others, but had led to her own demise. Her last moments were spent in desperation, trying to escape a fate she couldn't outrun. In the aftermath, the community was left to pick up the pieces. Neighbors spoke of the family with reverence, remembering them for the warmth and love they had shared. But the brutal events that had unfolded within the walls of their home would linger long after the police tape was taken down, a reminder of how quickly a life can be shattered by deceit and jealousy. As for the detectives, the case had left an indelible mark on them. The personal toll of witnessing such violence, the unraveling of a family by something as simple as a lie, was something they would carry with them forever. The justice they brought was necessary, but it didn't bring back the family they had lost. If this story shocked you, and you want to know more about the dark side of human nature, the cases that hide behind closed doors, and the chilling truth of what can happen when manipulation goes too far, subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on the latest true crime stories, and share this video to spread awareness of the dangers that lie beneath the surface of everyday life. Your thoughts and reactions matter. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think about this devastating case. We'll be discussing more true crime stories like this one, so join us as we uncover the truth, one case at a time.